Hey guys, welcome back to another tutorial on Azure Service Fabric. In the last tutorial, we looked at some of the theory behind how partitioning and replication works in stateful services. So in this video, we're going to look at putting this knowledge into practice and looking at how we can set up this partitioning and replication for a stateful service. So to do this, we're going to create a brand new Service Fabric application. So again, we open Visual Studio 2019 and click Create New Project. And the template we want to choose is Service Fabric Application. So we can search for that. And here it is here. So we click Next. And we need to give our product a name. So we're just going to call this one a Jumpstart Store because we're going to create a kind of a pseudo store application, which is highly available and highly scalable. So that's the name of our application. We click Create. And our first service will be a stateful service. So we want, say, a service that will store all of our products. And it will have high availability, obviously, by Service Fabric and by being replicated. And it'll also be very scalable, as we'll partition the service, say, on product ID, which means different parts of our service, which may be hosted on different nodes in our cluster, will handle different requests, which will allow us to scale much better than if we just had a kind of a single monolithic service. So we'll just call this service product catalog. And we'll create that. So Visual Studio has started up our application, and as usual, it opens up the docs when it's first created, so we can just close that. And we have our Service Fabric application Jumpstart Store, which has the usual application manifest, application parameters file, and also our stateful service product catalog, which has the usual service events stores and program class. Also our service manifest and the actual service class itself, which in this case inherits from stateful service, which makes this a stateful service. Now in this video, we won't be diving too heavily into the actual code and how this works down here and how actual storage of state works. We'll be more concerned with how the setup of our stateful service works. So how it's partitioned and how it's replicated. And actually most of that configuration goes on in the application manifest itself, and with configuration from our application parameters. If we load our application manifest, we can see that we have our product catalog parameters here, which define what our service will be like. So we have the min replica set size. So this is the minimum number of replicas of a partition that we should have at any one time. And we also have the product catalog partition count. So this is the number of partitions we have. So how many times we want to split our data into different sections that can then be placed on various different nodes across our cluster. And we finally have the target replica set size. So we have the min, so Service Fabric should never go below this min replica, but we also have a target. So the target could actually be higher than the minimum. And then Service Fabric will do its best to hit the target, but won't let the replica set size drop below the minimum size. So just for ease, we're actually just going to remove the product catalog annotation from the start of these parameters. So these are the parameters that we have here, and these are used down in this service section in the default services. So we'll just do what we did above. So we'll remove the annotation of product catalog just to make things a little bit shorter and a little bit easy to see. So these values here are brought down from our parameters section. So the target replica set size here will be set to 3. The min replica set size will also be set to 3. And our partition count will be set to 1. And we can override these variables in our local 1 and 5 node files here. So as you can see, for our local 5 node configuration, we have the exact same values. But when we're running on a 1 node configuration, we actually just have one partition, which is the same as the multi-node configuration. But because the 1 node cluster only has 1 node, we can't have a replica size greater than 1, because there is only 1 node to deploy the replica onto. Let's go ahead and deploy this service in its base configuration and see what happens. So we've jumped back into the Service Fabric Explorer, and we can see that our Jumpstart Store type and our Jumpstart Store application has been deployed with our single stateful service product catalog. And if we go in and click on our service, we can see that we have a single partition, and this is replicated across 3 nodes. So the primary replica is on node 1, the active secondaries are on 2 and 4, and this will be reflected in the node section. So we can click on node 1, we can see that we have our product catalog service and our primary replica. And on node 2, we can see that we have our active secondary replica there on node 2. So that's kind of deployed it in our default configuration. So we've got a single partition with 3 replicas. So let's stop the service, change some configuration, and see how that affects the setup in our Service Fabric Explorer. So we'll go back to the Jumpstart store, we'll stop the application. So to change the partition count, you can change it using the default value here, but this will be overwritten by the values in your application parameters file. So it's better to change values there if possible. Default value should really only be used as a kind of a backup, or if you usually want the same value across all your environments. So we'll go into the 5-node configuration here. And we can also see that we have these low key and high key parameters, and these are very important for partitioning as well. So we're actually going to define these as parameters up here as well and give them default values. So we'll call it partition low key and partition high key. And then we'll use these values instead of these values here. Partition low key as the low key and partition high key as the high key. At the moment they are defaulted 3 and 3, so we'll both just have a default value of 0. So we want to also add those parameters to our local 5-node configuration. So to do that, we just copy them in there, and instead of having default value, we just simply have value. So now we can overwrite all of our partition and replica configuration directly from an application parameters file. So say for this service, we might want to increase the partition count. So let's increase the partition count to 3. So like in our last example where we had the EU, the USA, and Japan, we now have that many partitions. But in conjunction with this, we also need to change our partition low key and high key. And usually the best way to do this is to set the low key to 0 and then set the partition high key to 1 less than the partition count. So this will let us use some sort of hashing algorithm. And this means that anything with a key of 0 will be routed to our first partition. Anything with a key of 1 will be routed to our second partition. And anything with a key of 2 will be routed through our third partition. So this is probably the simplest partitioning strategy that we have. So let's deploy this service now and see how the changes we made to partition count and partition low and high key will affect our service. So again, let's deploy that using the debugger and start new instance. So back in our Service Fabric application again, we can see that the Jumpstart store type application has been deployed. And here's the application and the product catalog service. So now when we click into this, we can see that we have 3 partitions, all identified by unique global unique identifier. So each partition, as we expected, has a single primary and 2 active secondaries to make up the 3 replica count or minimum replica count that we wanted. And we can also see that each primary is deployed on a different node. So node 0 for that one, node 1 and node 4. And that inside a single partition, all the replicas are deployed on different nodes, 0, 1 and 2, 1, 2 and 4, and 4, 0 and 3. And also Service Fabric tries to keep primaries off the same node. So we have one here, node 4, node 1, and node 0. But we can also have more partitions than we have nodes in our cluster. And this allows us to scale better. So say if we have a 5-node cluster and we have 15 partitions, this means that 3 primary replicas will probably be deployed on each node in our cluster. And as we scale out up to a maximum of 15 nodes, this means that every node will then have a primary partition. So that primary partition can take up all of that node's resources instead of just taking up 1/3 of it as it did when we had a 5-node cluster. So this allows us to scale effectively. And next we'll go and change the partition count to be above the number of nodes in our 5-node cluster to see what this looks like. So we go back to our service, we'll just simply stop it. And all we have to do is change the number of partitions here. So for instance, we might go for 10 partitions. So we've got a 5-node pseudo cluster running. And again, we have to change the low key and the high key to support this. So we'll change this to 9, which is 1 below the partition count. So let's redeploy our service and see what it looks like. So our service is again deployed, and if we go into our service, we can see that there are now many more partitions of our service. And again, each of the replicas on each partition is deployed across the cluster. But we can see that we might have multiple primaries on the same node. So for instance, so we can see that none so far. Node 4 here. So node 4 both hosts the primary for this partition and for this partition. And we might be able to see this better when we go into the node view. So let's have a look in here, and we'll see that node 0, this has a number of product catalog replicas, and a number of these might be primary or none of them might be primary. So we'll see this one has 3 active secondaries, 4 active secondaries, 1 primary, and 2 primaries. So 2 primaries, as expected, are deployed on this because Service Fabric will try and balance how it has the primaries throughout the cluster. And there's 5 nodes and 10 partitions, each partition with 1 primary replica. So that means each node will be expected to have 2 primary replicas. So for the next part of this video, we'll go back to our initial configuration, which was 3 partitions and 3 replicas. And we'll see how when a node goes down, what effect this will have on our cluster. So we have redeployed our application now, and we can see that we're back down to 3 partitions. So let's go into our node section and let's see what happens if we start messing around with a couple of different nodes. So let's open up these partitions and see what's going on. And let's open up the node section as well. So we can see we've got a primary on node 4, primary on node 2, and a primary on node 1. And on node 1, we also have this active secondary. So say if node 1 goes down, what would we expect to happen? We'd expect one of these 2 active secondaries to take over as the primary for node 1. We'd also then need to boot up another active secondary for this partition on another available node. So that would probably be node 2 or node 3. This active secondary will also go down, and this will have to be replaced by another active secondary, which in this case will probably be on node 4 or 5 because none of the replicas for that partition are currently located on those nodes. So to disable a node, we have to turn on advanced settings. So we go up to the settings cogwheel in the top corner and just click advanced mode. And then on node 1, which is the node we were going to restart, we click here and we go to deactivate remove data for now. Just copy this in to the bar there and deactivate. And this should deactivate the node and kind of simulate a node going down in our cluster. So let's observe what happens. So node deactivation started. Service Fabric should detect that that node is now down and reconfigure this primary and this active secondary. And it's already happened. So we can see the primary has moved to node 0 and we have some idle secondaries coming up. So these services are starting and the data from the other active secondaries starting to be streamed to them. Now the cluster has kind of regained health. Node 1 is still down. We can see we have no replicas on node 1. And we can see that the primary and new active secondaries have been either switched nodes or complete new replicas of the service have been started. So we can re-enable this now. So just click activate. And that should reactivate our node. And that means node 1 is now again available for services to move over to. And in a kind of an environment where there's a high amount of resource requirements on our cluster, Service Fabric should start moving services over to that new node. In this case, our services are very lightweight and aren't actually doing anything. So Service Fabric doesn't feel the need to move those active secondaries or primaries to that new node as all the minimum replica count constraints are already satisfied. So in this video, we looked at how we can change the partition count of our services and how when nodes go down, how this affects the instances of both primary and active secondary replicas of our service. In the next video, we'll look at how we can change the replica count, so the number of active secondaries per partition, and we'll also look at named partitioning. In this video, we only looked at partitioning based on numbers, so what I think is called uniform 64 partitioning. And the uniform 64 partition comes from, so that's the very big number that by default is used as the kind of high key and low key in our application manifest. So thanks for watching the video, guys. Hope you saw in practice some of the things that we discussed in the previous video. And the next video, we should round out the introduction to partitioning and replication for stateful services.